Hello everybody, welcome to the session about what's new in midpoint 4.2 called Maxwell. The session will start with introducing improvements and features done in midpoint 4.2. Then we will look closer to the plan for 4.3, and at the end the long-term plans for 5.0 will be presented. Midpoint 4.2, called Maxwell, was released a few weeks ago. It is one of the features releases, which means that there is a short support period, merely 1 year. In Midpoint 4.2, we did a lot of different improvements. Some of them are more remarkable, some of them might seem less. These features and improvements will be gradually described today during this session. Besides implementing new features, we also paid attention to bring better stability, performance, user experience, and reduce technological debt. So let's start with the features we consider more interesting and important. First of them is native reporting. Since the very beginning, Midpoint have had mechanism to create reports. It was based on the integration of Jasper framework. One could create Jasper report template, wrap it to the midpoint report object, and use it as a template for manual, one-time, or scheduled reports. It worked, and in many cases, it was maybe sufficient. The problem arose when you needed to customize the report in some way. For this reason, we also invested some time to prepare Midpoint plugin for Jasper Soft Studio. Even with it, it wasn't very straightforward to manage it. Therefore, a few years ago, we have started discussion about replacing Jasper with something different, and this something became Midpoint itself. Starting with 4.2, it is recommended to use native Midpoint mechanism for reports. But how does it work? Well, in 4.2, there are two different possibilities to configure reports, using object collections or dashboards. Both concepts were introduced in previous versions of Midpoint, so some might be familiar with them, but let's look on them quickly. Object collections, simply said, define filters according to which the objects are grouped in logical units. When speaking about the usage of object collections in reports, it simply means that objects belonging to the collections will be present in the generated report, or the generated report will contain all objects from the collection. The same object collection can be used for defining archetype objects, menu items, and since 4.2 also for reports. Other possibility to define native reports are dashboards. Midpoint 4.0 has come with experimental feature called dashboards. These dashboards are configurable and consist of as many different widgets as you configured. The reports based on dashboards works in two ways. You can generate reports with the details of the widgets, or you can include also summaries for the widgets. Of course, there is a possibility to configure columns for reports, and reports can be generated to two different formats, for now CSV and HTML. Other formats will be added later, at least export to native Excel format can be expected. Another major improvement is called linked objects. Midpoint objects don't live in isolation. They are usually connected in some way. For example, user has assignment to the role. Shadow is linked to the user. Organization can have users, roles, resources, and so on as members. Usually, when some linked object is changed, there should be other actions taken. For example, when the role definition changes and the new inducement was added, it probably influences all objects which have this role assigned. To apply the change in role, all objects assigned to it has to be recomputed. And this is the place where linked objects come to the scene. In previous versions, recomputing the members of the role after the role was changed has to be done manually. But linked objects introduced in 4.2 change the situation a bit. To configure linked objects, it is good to be familiar with policy rules. Using appropriate policy constraint with the new script execution action will do the work. You can think of script execution action as a bulk action which will run. There is a possibility to define sources and the concrete actions which will be executed on sources. In the previous example with role, it would be something like, if there is an addition for new inducement for the role, then get all objects which are members of the role and recompute them. One may wonder about performance when the role has a lot of members. No worries, besides script actions can be executed synchronously, probably suitable only when linked objects is one or there's just a small number of them. They can also be executed asynchronously, which is achieved using task templates, so the action is run on the background. However, in some situations, also these might not be sufficient. For example, a lot of users are members of a lot of roles which are changed by a bulk task. It would mean that these users will be recomputed many times instead of just one time. And therefore, there is also possibility to configure script execute action for delayed execution. In such configuration, the triggers are computed in some smart way and then stored to the objects. Later, the triggers launch and the correct action is executed. And there is a bunch of smaller features and improvements delivered with midPoint 4.2. One of them are improvements for archetypes. MidPoint archetypes are inspired by LDAP object classes. And so, same as for object classes, we can differentiate between three types of archetypes: structural, auxiliary, and abstract. Structural archetype is primary archetype. It defines the core of the object, how the object should look like, which attributes they have to have, and so on. Structural archetypes can inherit from other structural archetypes or from abstract archetypes, but they cannot inherit from auxiliary archetype. Merely, one structural archetype can be directly assigned to the user. Auxiliary archetypes can be used to provide additional information for the object. They tend to augment structural archetypes. Auxiliary archetypes can inherit from abstract archetypes or another auxiliary archetype. Auxiliary archetype can be directly assigned to the user, but only together with structural archetype. For now, midPoint supports only structural archetypes. Therefore, merely one archetype can be directly assigned to the object. When speaking about multiple archetype support in 4.2, it doesn't mean that since 4.2 you can assign as many archetypes to the object as you want. It means that the inheritance was added, so we can specify structural archetype hierarchies. The definitions from all archetypes in hierarchy are merged together. It not only merged definition about how the object should look like, but also assignments and inducements are executed. When you previously used audit log report delivered by default, or you looked at the audit-related dashboard examples, you probably noticed that the filter defining which records should be taken into account was written in SQL syntax. Since midPoint 4.2, this string SQL syntax is deprecated and it is not recommended to use it anymore. Instead, it is recommended to use native midPoint filters, the same filters which can be used in object collection, task, and so on. And regarding audit subsystem, there is another, I would say, major improvement. And it is that since 4.2, it has been possible to decouple audit database from database for midpoint objects. Basically, it means that you can have different databases for keeping audit records and different database for midpoint objects. During 4.2, we got also contribution from our partner AMI Prague. This contribution is about maintenance mode for resource. To prevent unexpected behavior of midpoint while there is maintenance on the resource, one can turn on maintenance mode for the resource. In such a mode, the behavior is very similar to behavior during any communication issue with the resource. The changes are saved, and after the resource is back up and running, the changes are executed. In 4.2, also support for outbound part for multi-accounts was added, and some small improvement for auto-assignment was also added. This small improvement is about possibility to restrict the focus for which the auto-assignments apply. Every release and the 4.2 was not different. We tried to make also improvements in the UI. We know that some parts of midpoint graphical user interface are too complex and they may lack good user experience. In 4.2, we decided to look closer on the search bar. The search bar can be found on every page showing the list of objects. The main goal was to simplify the usage of the search. Besides removing some unnecessary clicks, there is also possibility to predefine query in system configuration for almost every object. This query can be then used in graphical user interface just by checking the checkbox. Another improvement regarding query filters in graphical user interface is that there is a possibility to define the query filter in forms using query filter configurator. And of course, there were many other different improvements in graphical user interface. Every release also brings some cleanups, removals, and deprecations. 4.2 was not different. In this release, reports based on Jasper were deprecated. Support for SOAP services was removed. Also using SQL or HQL for audit log queries and dashboards were deprecated. .NET Remote Connector Server is no longer supported. Spring security modules are no longer available. And finally, Jasper Soft Studio plugin for midpoint is no longer available. As we noticed in previous versions, if you notice in previous version, we recommended to migrate to Java 11 because Java 8 is not supported anymore. There is also change in supporting Tomcat. Explicit deployment to Tomcat is deprecated, and Apache Tomcat 8.5 is no longer supported. Also, the support for Microsoft Internet Explorer is now at the end, so it was deprecated. And also there are changes in support for some databases. They are still supported, but the support is deprecated for MySQL and MariaDB. And PostgreSQL is strongly recommended. We recommend to use the PostgreSQL as a database for all new deployments. Of course, the support for other databases will be here for some period of time, but especially if you plan to deploy midpoint and at large scale, it is recommended to use Postgres. This decision was made based on the survey which ran last year, And the another reason is that we want to provide better performance and scalability, and it's easier to support it for one database. And as the research shown, it looks like PostgreSQL can help a lot with it. Okay, and what about the experimental features in 4.2? First of all, experimental features are experimental, so there is no support for bug fixing. If you decided to use experimental feature, it's on your own risk. Of course, we try to deliver also experimental features without bugs, but there can be a situation that the feature is not completed. Only some specific use cases were tested, and the one you are planning to use wasn't. One of such feature delivered in 4.2 is called reverse reports. You might encounter a situation when you needed to import objects from Excel, CSV file, or other file to the midpoint. To do it before 4.2, you had to prepare the file, write some custom scripts, and call appropriate midpoint API. Since 4.2, it is possible to use midpoint native mechanism for it. It can be achieved by configuring reports in midpoint, specifying that the reports should be executed in opposite direction or import direction. There is a possibility to define how various columns should behave, if any action should be executed, and so on. Another interesting component coming soon is Midpoint Studio. There was a predecessor for it, Eclipse plugin, implemented a few years ago. Even though it has never been officially supported, it became very popular, mostly among midpoint engineers deploying midpoint. All the Eclipse plugin had many issues from the very beginning. For example, the code auto-completion for GuruScript didn't work, and it turned out that the things which were missing or were very difficult to implement for Eclipse plugin might be either implemented in plugin for IntelliJ IDEA. Actually, 2 versions, alpha and beta, were already released. Midpoint, the development of Midpoint 4.2 was a little bit different from previous versions. The difference lies in fact that we got an NGI trust funding. The subject of the funding was MidPrivacy initiative, resulting to data provenance prototype. First, what is data provenance? The answer might be simple, as simple as the answer for the question, where did the data come from? Of course, there are more use cases addressed by data provenance. One of the key aspects is that data provenance provides transparency and accountability, which are the foundation for data protection. During the MidPrivacy initiative, we focused on metadata. Metadata maintained for every value. So if there is a multi-value property describing projects on which the student works, every single value will contain information where the value originated from, who was responsible to assign the student for a project, when it was done, and so on. To achieve storing metadata for every value, we first needed the language where it can be described. The whole midpoint data model is described in XSD schema. But how would you say in XSD schema that every value has another values describing metadata? It would be probably very difficult, as what comes to my mind is to change even simple properties such as string to complex types describing the metadata for them. We didn't see the way to do it like this. Therefore, we made some research about other schema data modeling languages, and we resulted with Axiom. Axiom is representation-independent data modeling language. Axiom can be used to model data in their abstract form. Unlike other modeling languages, Axiom is not bound to specific data representation forms such as JSON or XML. Data modeled in Axiom can be represented, serialized, and parsed in many representational formats. Simply speaking, the same data can be expressed in XML, JSON, YAML, and possibly also in other formats, including Axiom itself. In the picture, you can see the result of the midPrivacy. It describes the attribute full name with the value Leonard Euler. The same value originates from two separate sources. First, it was created based on the data in HR employee feed resource, but the same value was also propagated to midPoint as a combination for admin data entry together with self-service application. And here you can see the details of the provenance metadata. The details of where the value originates from, when the value was created, modified, who did it, which channel was used, and so on. And so what's about the plans for 4.3? 4.3 will be also feature release with the support lasting 1 year. The release is planned for spring 2021, hopefully in April. During the 4.3, the focus will be mostly on improving performance and scalability. A graphical user interface and user experience improvements can be expected as well. The main focus on performance and scalability is chosen also by the fact that we had the luck again and we got another NGA Trust funding for it. The aim is to be able to comfortably handle tens of millions or even hundreds of millions of identities. We know that the current repository component implementation was not designed to handle such amounts of data. Therefore, we decided for new repository implementation based on PostgreSQL and leaving out also Hibernate framework. Other improvements we expect regarding cluster mechanism, more specifically regarding better support for autoscaling. And of course, there will be many performance improvements on the places we identified that there are the bottlenecks and other hurdles. And also we expect some GUI stabilization and speed up. So when we look closer, one thing which I forgot to mention is that the midscale project will last for 1 year. So it will be spread through 2 midpoint releases, 4.3 and 4.4. So when we look closer at the plan for 4.3, we can see that there is a part midscale, and as a part of midscale, we will focus on the improvements and for query language. Actually, we are designing and planning to implement something like a domain-specific language for query in midpoint. There will be also new database schema for native schema for PostgreSQL. We expect at the stage of 4.3 it will be prototype, so probably not ready for production use. We also plan to do a lot of task improvements, mainly focused on visibility and manageability. So it will be easier to see what's happening right now in the system, which objects are processed, which errors happen, and so on. And also we want to improve the manageability of tasks. So at the end, it should be easier to create some partition task or multi-threaded task. And as the last but not least improvement, which will be part of mid-scale and also 4.3, is a Schrödinger testing framework. This Schrödinger testing framework is based on Selenium ID, and it is meant to be used for testing system as a whole. So you can write the test and test like end-to-end use cases. We also expect some GUI improvements. Mainly, we will focus on improving audit log viewer. These improvements is regarding the unification of this part of graphical user interface with others. So the same components you can be familiar with will be used. There will be also other search improvements. So one of them, we expect the integration of domain-specific language in GUI and also other improvements for the search bar, which with this improvement we have already started in 4.2, and now we want to finish them. And another maybe bigger improvement in graphical user interface is regarding self-service credentials. So we plan to rework this part of GUI as well. And also in 4.3, there will be support for our ActiveMQ for outbound part. So what about the next releases? So midpoint 4.4 will be a long-term support release, and we expect it will be released in autumn 2021. As it is LTS support, the support lasts at least for 3 years. And the main focuses in this release will be mid-scale. As I mentioned, mid-scale project will last for 1 year, so also it will be part for 4.4. We also expect improvements and better stability for midpoint studio, and hopefully we will get rid of Jasper at all. There are also some rough plans for midpoint 5.0, which I cannot say now when it will be released, but we expect after 2022. The main focus will be to go away from XSD and replace it with this new modeling language Axiom. And also there will be changes and improvements in public APIs. One of them, Prism API, which then can be used in the other components delivered by midpoint, like Java client or midpoint Studio, and also stabilization and improvements for graphical user interface API. So it will be easier to make some overlay extensions and so on. And we also plan, and there is also plan for midpoint 5.0 to implement new separated end user graphical user interface. So this was about the plans. We all are probably facing the not very comfortable situation with the corona these days. So Evolveum as a company tries to operate normally. We are working from home, and we don't plan any layoffs we are operating at full speed, and during the last years we gathered some financial reserves. And so if you like our work and you would like to support us, you can also help us with purchasing or prolonging midpoint subscription if you want and can. So thank you very much for your attention, and now there is a time for discussion. So if you have any question, you can ask.
So maybe I will start. Thanks for the introduction. I have a question concerning the midpoint studio. Is it possible to use midpoint studio with older versions of midpoint 2, for instance 3.9?
It's a very good question. Midpoint Studio is based on REST API, and there weren't a lot of changes, so it might be possible. However, I didn't try.
Yeah, we haven't tested it. Well, at least some functions should work on older versions, but there is no guarantee. You know, it is designed to work with 4.2 and later versions.
Thanks.
Maybe I would add a little bit about the studio and the future. So currently the studio is released in the beta quality, and I would like to ask everybody of you that is interested to try it. With midpoint 4.2, maybe even older versions of midpoint. The reason I'm asking this is that we would like to fix the last bugs and a little bit later release the first real version of midpoint studio, because studio is going to be the primary IDE, integrated development environment for midpoint. So this will help us to get us to the usable state. As of now, the midpoint studio should have all the code working. There are all the features that were in the or all the important features that were there in the old Eclipse plugin. It has just received a limited amount of testing, so it theoretically should work. But I would like you to make sure that it works even in practice.
Okay, I can see the question from Adam. Are there any plans to help those on non-PostgreSQL to migrate? We are currently running Oracle as our repository. So first of all, the plans are that we will support other databases sometime after there is the full support for PostgreSQL. And so if you don't miss any new features and improvements, and the performance in your environment is quite well, you can still stay on your current database. But to the question if there are any plans to help with migration, I would say there will be some way. We will provide to our customers how they can migrate. So yes, I think that there is a plan for it.
For sure, yeah, there's definitely a plan to create the migration tools at the latest in midpoint 4.4, but I hope that at least some tools will be available earlier than that. And for midpoint 4.4, there will be still ability to use your current database. So the existing implementation of repository is not going away in midpoint 4.4, it will be there. So you will have some migration period to switch to Postgres if you want to.
You're welcome. Okay, there is another question. Are there changes in REST API from 4.1 and 4.2? No, the only change is at the background. So we changed the framework. Before we used CXF, and now we are on Spring, but no changes in API. Okay, so if there are no other questions, I think that we can finish the session for today.
Okay, thank you, Katka, for excellent presentation.
Thank you.